Hello, and welcome to Obscure Fare, the podcast dedicated to the study of humanity's lesser-known attempts to kill each other. I'm your host, Henry Edwards. This episode is the second part of our series on the Indian Mutiny of 1857. Last time, we met such characters as Nana Sahib, the usurper Peshawar of Oudh, and Major General Sir Hugh Wheeler, the defender of Cawnpore. We saw how the former joined a growing rebellion against the corrupt East India Company and the incompetent British administration of the subcontinent, laying siege to a makeshift earthwork in the heart of the British station in the city of Cawnpore, in which the latter had gathered a small garrison and more than 500 civilians. I highly recommend you listen to the last episode. It'll make this one much easier to follow. I should also add, before we begin, that this episode will contain graphic depictions of violence against women and children, and, possibly the worser evil, my appalling pronunciation. But let's get started. On the 14th of June, 1857, the daring Captain Moore, who we met last time, led yet another intrepid sortie out of the entrenchment, this time to spike the guns of the batteries in the station's church and former officers' mess of the 56th. They succeeded, but the rebels simply replaced the guns with fresh ones. They had an entire city's worth, after all, and Wheeler forbade any further assaults on the grounds that they were too risky, and the casualties, 1 killed and 4 wounded, were too many for such a small garrison to withstand. The Nana's forces, on the other hand, were growing by the day. On the 16th, he was joined by the 4th and 5th Oudh Infantry Regiments, who loudly boasted that they would take the entrenchment within 2 days. 2 days passed, and every assault they mounted failed, not helped by the fact that they were completely unsupported by the rest of the mutineers' force, who were still wary of assaulting the British, and riven with social and religious differences, as well as petty factional disputes between the individual commanders. And so the siege continued. The Nana was, however, a deeply superstitious man. He frequently consulted his guru or spiritual leader, a man by the name of Dabby Dean, who told him that the deadline for crushing Wheeler's pocket of resistance was the 23rd of June, the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Plassey, the engagement in which Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal and secured the East India Company dominance over the subcontinent. Command of this assault was given to Subadar Major Radhay Singh, commander of the 1st Native Infantry, the regiment that had been instrumental to the success of the British at Plassey. He had sworn that he and his men would atone for this black mark on their careers, or die in the attempt. He would lead almost 4,000 men, mostly infantry, but with some 500 sowars in support, and would be covered by the heavy fire from the Nana's myriad artillery batteries. To receive them were fewer than 250 able-bodied men. Moore had ordered every civilian man issued with a rifle, which had somewhat increased the strength of their garrison, but still it seemed to the British as though they would be overrun. As dawn broke over Cawnpore on the 23rd, the mutineers made their first move. From the ruins of the city, directly north of the entrenchment, the sowars of the 2nd Cavalry and Oudh Irregulars came into sight, but stopped just beyond the range of Wheeler's guns. Then the Nana's artillery burst into life, hurling a wicked fire of round shot and shell over the cavalrymen to suppress the entrenchment's defenders. A horn sounded from the ranks of the mounted men, and they started to advance towards the battery at the northwest corner of the British position, shouting "Deen, Deen," Arabic for the faith. They had made a critical mistake, however. By covering the half-mile between the riding school and the British at a gallop, they had comprehensively worn out their horses, and they were forced to slow to a walk at about 75 yards from the battery. There, Major Vibart's 3 guns opened fire on them with canister, and Wheeler, who had left his sickbed to personally supervise the defence, puts it well, quote, "One volley of grape was enough, bringing down so many horses and riders that the rest were thrown into a hopeless confusion, and all who were not biting the dust wheeled round and retired." End quote. As the cavalrymen withdrew, another assault was formulating in the church compound, just behind the riding school, but still to the northwest of the entrenchment. About 100 men from the 1st were advancing and pushing before them several huge bales of cotton, designed to shield the mutineers from the canister of the British. This plan was also a humiliating failure. The guns simply set the dry, flammable bales alight, and this caused the men pushing them to panic, disrupting the formation of the assault and bringing it to a halt at about 150 yards from Vibart's battery. Jonah Shepherd, a Eurasian civilian who was posted at this position, described what happened next. Quote, "The insurgents in the rear gave up a fearful shout, and springing up on the walls, made a charge, led on by their Subadar major, who was a powerful-looking man. But the first shots from our musketry caught him, and he took a bound and fell dead. A few rounds of canister, then properly directed amongst them, did good execution, causing a general dispersion." End quote. This Subadar major was Radhay Singh himself, the commander of the attack, and with him dead, the remaining men of his regiment fled back to the city. At the same time as this assault was being repulsed, Lieutenant Mowbray Thompson's beleaguered command in the second unfinished barrack to the southwest of the entrenchment came under a heavy fire from some 500 sepoys. The defenders barricaded the door, and Thompson recalled, quote, "Mainwaring's revolver dispatched 2 or 3. Sterling, with an Enfield rifle, shot one and bayoneted the other, and both charges of my double-barreled gun were discharged, and not in vain. There were 17 of us in that barrack, and they left 18 corpses lying outside the doorway." End quote. The remaining sepoys, disillusioned by their repeated failures, were easily driven off by Captain Moore, who arrived with a party of just 25 volunteers to relieve Thompson. By midday, the real power behind the mutineers, Subadar Tika Singh, had called off the attack. Radhay Singh, no relation, had kept his promise and fought ably, but the other officers of the mutineers had continued in their lacklustre vein, and their men had proven timorous and inept, particularly the cavalry. Wheeler returned to his rooms to give his family the good news, only to find that his son, Gordon, who had acted as his messenger and aide-de-camp, and who had been much loved by the garrison, had tragically been decapitated by a round shot that had splattered his hair and blood all over the room, and his family who were within it. The siege had already taken a considerable toll on Wheeler, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back. He would barely talk for the remainder of the conflict, rarely moving, eating, or sleeping. One of his few actions was to write a final letter to Henry Lawrence at Lucknow. It read, quote, "British spirit remains, but it cannot last forever. We have no instruments of war, no medicine, provision for a few days at most, and no possibility of getting any more, as all communication with the town is cut off. We have been cruelly deserted and left to our fate. We had not 220 soldiers of all arms at first, and the casualties have been numerous. Railwaymen and merchants have swollen our ranks to what they are. Small as that is, we have done excellent service, but neither they nor I can last much longer. We have all lost everything belonging to us, and I have not even a change of clothes. Are we really to die like rats in a cage?" End quote. Lawrence wrote a reply on the 27th of June, which urged caution and determination. It told of a relief force, commanded by Brigadier Havelock, who we shall meet next week, which had left Allahabad and would reach Cawnpore in 2 days. Of surrender, he wrote, quote, "I hope, therefore, that you will husband your resources, and not accept any terms from the enemy, as I much fear treachery. You cannot rely on the Nana's promises. He does not take prisoners." End quote. Lawrence was an adept spy master, and so had learned of many occasions on which the Nana, and more importantly the sepoy officers who controlled him, had ordered the mass murder of civilian captives. On the morning of the 12th of June, 120 women and children from the British station at Fatehgarh had been led out of the Nana's cells and into the field in front of Savada House, his palatial residence. There, as their Eurasian companions and native servants were separated and made to watch, they were made to dig a long trench, lined up in it, and shot. Those who survived were hacked to death, and the Eurasian servants and civilians were made to fill in the trench before being led back to their cells. Lawrence knew about this, and knew the same fate would befall Wheeler and his command, were they to surrender. Wheeler, being so comprehensively cut off, knew nothing, and Lawrence's warning would not arrive until it was too late. The garrison had successfully repulsed a major assault by the rebels, but nonetheless was in a dire state. Just over half of its original number remained. Water was still scarce, and so none of the defenders or civilians washed. Food shortages meant they barely ate, and the constant bombardment deprived most of any sleep. On the 24th of June, Jonas Shepherd, motivated by a desire to save those of his family who still lived, volunteered to sneak out of the entrenchment and determined the state of the rebel forces. He would take a large amount of money and attempt to bribe the senior officers and officials in the Nana's court, sowing dissent in the rebel ranks. In return, he wanted permission to take his family with him so that they could escape. Wheeler gave permission, and he slipped out of the entrenchment that night, disguised as a sepoy. He was quickly arrested and taken to the Nana, but his disguise held up, and they believed that he was a native cook who had defected from the British, rather than a mixed-race civil servant. He was told by his interrogators that an elderly Eurasian lady had been sent to Wheeler with terms for surrender, and he thus assumed that his own release was imminent. In fact, he would remain in captive until mid-July. That evening, the 25th, Mrs. Greenway, the wife of a leading Cawnpore merchant, arrived in the entrenchment with a letter. The letter contained terms for surrender. The British must lay down their arms and give up their cannon to the mutineers, and all those who were not connected with the acts of Lord Dalhousie, who had been Governor-General until 1856 and was immensely unpopular with the mutineers, would be given safe passage to British-controlled Allahabad. The letter was not signed, though, and it is on these grounds that Wheeler rejected the terms, as they could feasibly have come from anyone. The next day, another Eurasian woman, Mrs. Jacoby, arrived in the entrenchment with another letter, containing the same terms, but this time signed by the Nana. Wheeler at once called a conference of his senior officers, most notably Moore, Vibart, and Whiting, the entrenchment's chief engineer. Moore and Whiting made the case that their position was hopeless. They had only 3 days' provisions left, and that it was better to accept favourable terms than to fight on and be forced to accept unfavourable ones. Most of the other officers, and indeed the garrison as a whole, disagreed. They feared treachery, and were still hopeful that the relief would arrive, and so advocated for fighting on. Wheeler, though, had been crippled by the siege. Most of his family, including both of his sons, were dead, and Lawrence's warning had not yet arrived, so he consented, and reluctantly drew up a treaty of surrender. On the afternoon of the 26th, a meeting took place between the two sides to negotiate. Moore and Whiting represented Wheeler, and they met with Azimullah Khan and Brigadier Jwala Prasad, who represented the Nana and the mutineers respectively, in the centre of the plain between Savada House and the entrenchment. Khan put forward that the Nana was willing to provide passage to Allahabad by boat, but in return the British must surrender their arms, ammunition, and treasure. Moore presented a counter-offer, that each man be allowed to leave with a sidearm and 60 rounds of ammunition, and that carriages be provided to carry the many sick and wounded to the boats, which were moored at the Satichaura Ghat on the river Ganges. To this Khan agreed, on the condition that the garrison leave that very evening. Moore rejected this, and insisted that the garrison would not be ready to leave until the next evening, the 27th, at the very earliest. This was agreed, and the treaty amended, and signed by the Nana, Wheeler, and the delegates. The next morning, Wheeler sent a party of officers, namely Captain Turner, formerly of the 1st Native Infantry, and Lieutenants Delafosse and Goad, formerly of the 53rd and 56th respectively, down to the Ghat, which is a sort of wharf, to inspect the boats. Captain Turner wrote about the experience, quote, "The boats, of which there were about 40, were moored and apparently ready for departure, some of them roofed and the rest undergoing the process. We saw the apparent victualling of some of the boats, as in our presence a show of furnishing them with supplies was made, although before the morning there was not left in any of them a sufficient meal for a rat. They returned to the entrenchment without the slightest molestation, though I had been made very uneasy by the repetition of the word cuttle, which I overheard passing from man to man by the men of the 56th Native Infantry, who were present on the river's bank." End quote. Cuttle, rather ominously, is the Hindi word for massacre. There was another slightly suspicious event, late in the evening of the 26th. The garrison were more or less ready to depart, but the Nana sent word that the evacuation would have to be postponed until the next morning, as he could not arrange for enough transport to take the British to the Ghat. Nonetheless, he insisted that Wheeler uphold his end of the bargain and hand over his guns and treasure, a sum of about 120,000 rupees. When Wheeler protested and threatened to resume hostilities, the mutineers sent a delegation of hostages to show their good faith. One of the hostages was Brigadier Prasad, who was, by all accounts, an insufferable man. He spent the entire evening ridiculing the broken Wheeler to his face, stating at length what an indictment on his character the mutiny of his men was. He did, however, personally assure the garrison that they would be kept safe and alive. An incident during the night did not help to reassure the defenders, though. A sepoy's musket discharged accidentally, causing the soldiers posted around the British position to panic and fire a volley into the entrenchment. Luckily, no one was hurt, and Prasad was sent out to explain what happened, but nonetheless, the willingness of the sepoys to fire on their British counterparts, whom they had promised to keep alive, was an indictment. In the early morning of the 27th, the garrison started to make its final preparations for evacuation. Folks dug up crates of treasure they had buried at the onset of siege and packed away their surviving heirlooms as well as those of their deceased comrades. An hour or two after sunup, the vehicles tasked with escorting the evacuees arrived. 16 elephants, 80 palanquins, and some bullock carts. The wounded were given the palanquins, padded boxes carried by native servants, as they were the most comfortable method of travelling. Most of the loading, of baggage and casualty alike, was done by the British, the sepoys mostly refusing assistance, instead preferring to ransack the entrenchment for plunder and otherwise rob the fugitives. Amy Horn remembered it thus, quote, "Our bundles, money, and what few valuables we had were forcibly taken away. Captain Kempland of the 56th was severely beaten by some of the Sowars because he refused to surrender his rifle, and many other officers were served in like manner." End quote. Not all of the British were so easily disarmed, though. When a sepoy demanded a private of the 32nd Foot hand over his rifle, the private responded by pointing it at the sepoy and saying, quote, "You may have the contents if you please, but you shall not have this gun." End quote. Most of the officers, especially Moore and Wheeler, were viciously verbally abused on their way to the Ghat. Not all of the mutineers were so hostile, though. A large party of Sowars sought out Major Bibigarh, their erstwhile commander, and insisted on escorting him, his wife, and the rest of his family down to the Ghat, carrying his luggage for him and greatly praising the British defence. Similarly, some sepoys of the 53rd spoke to Lieutenant Thompson, expressing their admiration for the garrison that had held out for so long against so many, and telling him that their own casualties were almost 1,000 dead and many more wounded. Thompson asked the sepoys whether they were truly to be sent to Allahabad in safety, and the mutineers responded with such a certain yes that he firmly believed that they knew nothing of what was to come. The column left that shattered refuge that was their entrenchment at about 8, with Moore, Whiting and Wheeler leading the group, all on ponies. Bringing up the rear, and similarly mounted, was Major Bibigarh, and as he left the entrenchment, a group of Cawnpore townsfolk flooded over the ditches and rampart to pick over the detritus of the garrison for any sign of value. The route to the Ghat was about a mile, over a deep ravine and past the compounds of the late Colonel Williams of the 56th and a leading Cawnpore merchant, Henry Christie, who had died a few days earlier in the entrenchment from heat exhaustion. This was late June, remember, and the rains had not yet come, so the Ganges was unusually dry and shallow, about 100 yards less wide than was typical. The sandbanks that filled the Ganges were not usually an issue, but the water had become so shallow that many were visible above the surface, and would surely prove an obstacle to any boats that sought passage. By the time Bibigarh had left the entrenchment, Wheeler and the foremost members of the column were already half a mile in front, and when they reached the Ghat, they found the banks lined, oddly, with sepoys, Sowars, and townsfolk. Here, the mutineers broke another of the terms of their treaty. The loyal native troops, those who had elected to stay with the British, were led away from the rest of the column and imprisoned, despite the protestations of their European colleagues that they had been given permission by that treaty to accompany them. The Nana was torn between the desires of the bloodthirsty sepoy officers, Tika Singh and Jwala Prasad particularly, and his own distaste about killing Indians or Eurasians. The compromise was to lock them up in the relative comfort of Savada House whilst they waited trial, a trial that incidentally never materialised. Jemadar Khoda Bucks was still there when the British retook Cawnpore a month later, and he would go on to write a very comprehensive first-hand account of the siege, which has proven invaluable to me in the writing of this episode. So thanks Nana Sahib, I guess. Towards the back of the column was Colonel John Ewart, former commander of the 1st Native Infantry, the man who had sworn that his men, the most mutinous regiment at Cawnpore, would only mutiny over his dead body. He was being carried in a palanquin because of a severely mangled arm, and his wife Emma was walking alongside him. A group of his former subordinates marched over to them and, pretending to be concerned for his health, insisted that Ewart step out of his palanquin. Then they dropped him on the ground and began to mock him, saying such things as, quote, "Are the troops well turned out now, Colonel?" End quote. After a few minutes of this sport, they hacked him to death with their bayonets, before turning on his stricken wife, whom they had forced to watch. They told her to leave, that they would let her alone, but as soon as she turned to run, they killed her as well. Unaware of the murders, and of the arrests of the loyal sepoys, Wheeler and Moore were still confident that the Nana would keep his word. As most of the column reached the riverbank, they had some difficulty embarking, finding that the boats were oddly far away from the shore, and that they were forced to wade through a significant amount of water to get to them. The boats were filled according to rank, both military and social. Wheeler and his family, along with another 50 of the most senior Europeans, were in the foremost boat. Amy Horn was in one of the rearmost boats, and she describes the farcical loading. Quote, "The boats were not very close to the shore, and we had to wade through the water as best we could. It was really very painful to witness the exertions of the aged, the sick and the wounded, who got on board with no little difficulty. All this time the enemy were looking upon us like so many fiends, exulting over our distressing situation, taunting and mocking us. Every boat was crowded to suffocation." End quote. The consequence of this overfilling was that the boats sank further into the already shallow water and buried themselves in the myriad sandbanks. The entire column had loaded onto the boats by about 9 o'clock, and Major Bibigarh's boat was the first to move. It contained, coincidentally, a very high proportion of the garrison's capable officers, including Bibigarh himself, the noble Moore, Whiting, the engineer, and Lieutenants Ash and Delafosse. As it began to drift downstream, a signal from Brigadier Prasad caused the oarsmen on every craft to jump off the boats, knocking over lit braziers as they went, and lighting tapers that had been concealed in the thatch roofs. The Sowars who had escorted Bibigarh and his family showed their true colours, and opened fire on the boats with their pistols. Moore's negotiation proved invaluable here, as the startled garrison were able to drive the cavalrymen back away from the boats with a volley from their sidearms. Countless more sepoys filled their place, however, and lined the banks, pouring fire into the trapped boats. As Thompson put it, quote, "Now from ambush in which they were concealed all along the banks, it seemed that thousands of men fired upon us, besides 4 9-pounders, carefully masked and pointed to the boats. Every bush was filled with sepoys." End quote. The Nana had placed on one bank his entire original force, the cavalry, 1st, 53rd and 56th Native Infantry regiments, and the 2 guns of the Oud Irregular Artillery. On the other was Bondu Singh and his recently arrived 17th Native Infantry Regiment, and another 2 guns. Thompson continues and describes in detail the chaos that ensued. Quote, "Those of us who were not disabled by wounds now jumped out of the boats and endeavoured to push them afloat, but alas, most of them were totally immovable. Some of the boats were broadsided by the guns, others were raked from stem to stern by the shot. Volumes of smoke from the thatch somewhat veiled the full extent of the horrors that morning. All who could move were speedily expelled from the boats by the heat of the flames, but alas, the wounded were burnt to death. Wretched multitudes of women and children crouched behind the boats, or waded out into deeper water and stood up to their chins in the river to lessen the probability of their getting shot. Meanwhile, Bibigarh's boat had gotten off and was drifting down the stream, her thatched roof unburned. I threw into the Ganges my father's medals, my mother's portrait, and all other property I had left, and I struck out, desperately swimming for the retreating boat." End quote. Massacre is certainly the most fitting word for the Satichaura Ghat affair. Most of the boats were on fire, so the survivors were forced to flee to the shore, where they were invariably slaughtered by the angry locals, as well as, of course, the mutineers. Wheeler was killed by a sword stroke to the neck that near enough decapitated him. The Reverend Moncrief tried to protect his family by pleading with the sepoys, saying, quote, "If we English take prisoners, we do not put them to death, but imprison them. Spare our lives and put us in prison." His pleas fell on deaf ears. He, his wife, and their small children were all bayoneted to death. Colonel Williams's daughter persuaded a group of sepoys to spare her, out of respect for her father, but she was killed when a villager stove her head in with a club. Infants and children were bayoneted or drowned by the dozen. Eventually the commotion died down, the survivors were rounded up, and the men separated off and shot. The women and children were led off to Savada House, numbering about 120 souls, and here the Nana had them imprisoned. Amid the chaos, only 3 boats managed to escape that slaughter. Vibart's was the first, but it quickly became trapped in a sandbank, enabling Thompson and some others to catch up and climb aboard. The other 2 boats were disabled by the guns, one drifting back towards the bank to be boarded by men of the 17th, who killed the male passengers and sent the women and children to join their comrades in captivity. The other was holed below the waterline and started to sink, but was luckily very close to Vibart's craft when it did so, enabling the occupants to swim over to the now solitary vessel. Again, I'll use Thompson's account. Quote, "Now the crowded state of our poor ark left little room for working her. Her rudder was shot away. We had no oars, for all of these had been thrown overboard by the treacherous boatmen, and the only implements that could be brought into use were a spar or 2, and such pieces of wood as we could safely tear away from the sides. Grape and round shot flew about us from either bank of the river, and shells burst constantly on the sandbanks in our vicinity. Alternatively stranding and drifting, we were often within 100 yards of the guns on the Oud side of the river, and we saw them load, prime, and fire their ordnance into our midst. Shortly after midday, we got out of range of their great guns. The sandy bed of the riverbank had disabled their artillery bullocks. Nonetheless, they chased us the whole day, firing in volleys of musketry incessantly." End quote. Sadly, 2 of the men killed aboard this ill-fated craft were the 2 men who had done most to help the defenders over the course of the siege, Captain Moore and Lieutenant Ash. Lieutenants Bolton and Fagan were killed by the same cannonball. Colonel Wiggins was shot by a musket ball as he cowered behind the boat's side, and Thompson was hit by a bullet that grazed his temple, knocking him unconscious. It was lucky, really, that he woke up when he did, because the other passengers were just about to throw what they assumed to be his corpse over the side. Progress was slow, and by the next morning, 24 hours after their departure from the blood-stained Ghat, they had still only travelled 10 miles. That afternoon, they were attacked by the forces of Babu Ram Buksh, a disgruntled Oud warlord. Whiting was killed, as well as Lieutenant Harrison. Captain Turner had both of his legs crippled, and Vibart was wounded in his only good arm. 2 more officers and a woman called Mrs. Seppings sustained injuries. Their perils increased further when a boat full of sepoys, numbering more than 50 men, approached them at high speed. The mutineers' boat grounded on a sandbank, though, and Thompson led a charge against it, killing some 20 of its occupiers and scattering the rest. The boat had been scuttled, and so was of no use to the British, but it did, however, contain a large amount of ammunition, although no food or water. That night, the stricken ark was blown into a muddy portion of the bank, where it was trapped and quickly discovered by the mutineers. Again, Thompson led a charge of 12 men of the 84th and Lieutenant Delafosse, driving back the sepoys once again. This party was then in turn attacked by another group of Buksh's men, who were similarly repulsed, but when Thompson and his intrepid group returned to where the boat had grounded, it was gone. Whilst they'd been away, the boat had been attacked by a 3rd group of mutineers, and with his casualties increasing, Vibart had no choice but to surrender. He died of his wounds during the journey back to Savada House, and the other male occupants of the boat were shot on arrival, including a woman, Mrs. Boyes, who refused to leave her husband's side. The other women and children were interned with the rest. The only hope for Thompson now was an overland flight. They were chased for 3 miles by an armed mob of sepoys and locals, who pursued them to a temple in which the British locked themselves. He recalled, quote, "The mob came on helter-skelter in such maddening haste that some of them fell or were pushed onto our bayonets, and there their transfixed bodies made the barrier impassable to the rest, upon whom we, from behind our novel defence, poured shot after shot." End quote. Just one of the defenders had been killed by the time the rebels flushed them out by setting the temple on fire. The party fled back across the river, with only 4 of their original 13 reaching the other bank. There they proceeded upriver for 3 miles, mostly unmolested by the rebels, until they came across a party of armed men in the service of the powerful Oud warlord Raja Dirigibija Singh of Balrampur. At first, Thompson and his men were worried, but the Raja was a stoic supporter of the British, and the party were escorted to his fort at Morau Mau, where they remained in comfort until Cawnpore was reconquered a month later. On at least 3 occasions, the Nana sent delegations to Singh, demanding that he hand over the fugitives in the name of the Peshwar of Oud. Each time, the fierce old Raja's response was the same, quote, "I am a servant of the King of Oud. I know nothing of your authority." End quote. Eventually, Thompson and his 3 colleagues, Lieutenant Delafosse and the 2 privates, joined up with the British relief force. They were the only European men to escape the massacre at Satichaura Ghat. Lastly to consider is the fate of those women and children who were taken to Savada House on the orders of the Nana. It was not practical to keep all 200 or so captives in the house itself, so they were moved to a different building, the Bibigarh. This was a villa built to house the mistresses of British officers. The name itself translates to House of the Women. It was a small building, certainly too small to house 200 people, even though most of them were children. They were given starvation rations and denied water or medical treatment. Around 2 women or children are estimated to have died each day. 14 died when cholera infected what little water they had, and although the Nana insisted that conditions be improved, it was about to get much worse for the inhabitants of that house. This time, early July, the British relief force was threatening Cawnpore, and the mutineers resolved to mount a fighting retreat. This would of course not be possible with 200 attenuated prisoners, so the question arose as to what to do with them. The Nana was loath to kill them, as he feared the reprisals, but his ever-bloodthirsty puppeteers who commanded the sepoy regiments insisted that they had to die, and so the orders were issued. First to die were those 5 men in the compound who had been spared, and a 14-year-old boy. They were executed by firing squad at 4:30 on the 16th of July, and the woman in charge of running the Bibigarh, the servant of one of Nana Sahib's lovers, told her captives that they would be next. Some of the bolder women, led by the late Captain Moore's wife, went to see Jemadar Yusuf Khan, who commanded the sepoy guard on the house, and demanded answers. His response was that his sepoys would not shoot women and children, and indeed when the orders were issued to execute the inhabitants, the sepoys refused. Tatia Tope, one of the Nana's senior advisers, was then brought in to resolve the dispute, and he threatened to have the entire guard executed if they did not carry out their orders. The sepoys decided to comply and made a half-hearted attempt to remove the hysterical women and children one by one to be executed. When this proved too strenuous, they simply opened the windows and fired volleys into the house from outside, mostly, on their insistence, aimed at the ceiling. After a while, the sepoys again refused to obey their orders and abandoned their weapons. The woman who ran the house, known by the insulting honorific Begum, resolved to solve the problem by sending for her own lover, Sarwar Khan, a member of the Nana's personal bodyguard. He brought with him a group of Muslim butchers from the city, and the group marched into the building and cut down the indignant Mrs. Moore, who had tried to refuse them entry. The 73 women and 124 children who had been locked in that house were hacked to pieces, unable to resist or flee. The butchers used meat cleavers, and the Khan broke 3 swords, such was the force with which he struck people. Not all of them were dead, however. My source for the entire Bibigarh Massacre is John Fitchett, a Eurasian drummer who had been locked in the building with the captives. The Nana had forbidden the execution of Eurasians, so he and several other drummers were removed and shut in a shed across the courtyard from the blood-stained house. He describes hearing the cries of the wounded for several hours, as well as the shrieks of those few children who had survived the slaughter. After a few hours, the bodies, wounded, dead and alive alike, were thrown down a well in front of the building. So numerous were the bodies that the wounded would have been buried alive under the weight of their dead. The children, all of whom were between 5 and 7, had their heads dashed against a large tree and were also thrown down the erstwhile waterway. And so, all but 6 of the European inhabitants of Cawnpore lay dead. The survivors were the 4 men led by Thompson, Jonah Shepherd, who was eventually freed from his captivity by the British Relief Force, and Amy Horn, who had been taken as a concubine by one of the Sowars at the Ghat, and so had been spared. She escaped and wrote another account, which has been similarly useful to me here. Cawnpore was eventually retaken, but I'll cover the fate of the mutineers who besieged it after we cover the Siege of Lucknow in the next 2 episodes. The British were so angry about the slaughter that they ordered the execution of anyone involved, and for the rest of the war, the rallying cry for the British would be "Remember Cawnpore." The defence had been heroic, but in the end it had been the treachery of the Nana Sahib and his mutinous officers that had laid low Wheeler and his stout comrades. So that's it for this episode. I dearly hope I've done Cawnpore justice, but if you want a more comprehensive account of the siege and its subsequent massacres, check out the accounts by Amy Horn, Coda Bucks, Jonah Shepherd and Lieutenant Thompson, or some history books on the mutiny. I would recommend Saul David, as always, and William Dalrymple. Next episode, we'll cover the Siege of Lucknow and its outcomes, which will involve a slight jump back in time, for which I apologise. Nonetheless, I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, there is a Patreon you can use to support the show, and it has a bunch of very respectable perks for those who choose to do so, not least a series of bonus episodes on conflicts too short to warrant their own episodes. Patrons of all ranks will get a shout out at the end of episodes, so if you do want to join the Obscure Fair rank and file and win my undying gratitude, go to patreon.com/obscurefair. Please also remember to fill out the feedback form in the description. It's very useful for me and free for you, so I really appreciate it. But with the shameless self-promotion out of the way, I hope you've enjoyed this episode on the heroism and tragedy of the Siege of Cawnpore, and I hope you tune in to the next episode on the similar feats of heroism and tragedy that define the Siege of Lucknow. But for now, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good day.